Plane crashes are terrifying enough, but some go beyond disaster into the realm of deeply disturbing. From chilling final moments to mysterious disappearances and gruesome recoveries, these incidents aren't just tragic, they're haunting. Here's a look at the most disturbing plane crash deaths of all time that still shock the world today. On October 13, 1972, a Fairchild FH-227D carrying 45 people, including a Uruguayan rugby team, their friends and family took off with high spirits and dreams of playing a match in Chile. But somewhere over the Andes, disaster struck. Due to bad weather and a tragic navigation error, the plane crashed violently into the mountains, instantly killing 12 passengers and leaving the rest stranded in a frozen wasteland at 12,000 feet. With no rescue in sight, freezing temperatures, and minimal supplies, the survivors were thrust into a nightmare few could even imagine. They huddled together for warmth inside the broken fuselage, hoping each sunrise would bring helicopters and salvation. But after 10 days, a heartbreaking radio announcement shattered that hope. The search had been called off. Faced with starvation, the survivors made a harrowing decision that would shock the world. They would survive by consuming the bodies of those who had died. It was not a choice made lightly, but one of necessity, driven by the overwhelming instinct to live. As if their ordeal couldn't get worse, an avalanche struck their shelter on the 17th day, burying the wreckage and killing 8 more people. The survivors now faced the Andes not only with grief and guilt, but with dwindling strength and hope. Realizing that waiting any longer meant certain death, 2 of the strongest men, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, set out to do the unthinkable. Crossed the mountains on foot. With almost no gear and suffering from weeks of starvation, they hiked for 10 days across steep, snow-covered terrain, enduring unimaginable hardship. At last, they encountered a Chilean shepherd across a river and managed to get a message across. This moment marked the turning point. Rescue helicopters were dispatched, and on December 23rd, 72 grueling days after the crash, the remaining 16 survivors were airlifted to safety. What the rescuers found was beyond belief: a group of emaciated, frostbitten souls who had endured one of the most harrowing survival stories ever recorded. The world was stunned as details emerged. While some headlines sensationalized cannibalism, the deeper truth was one of unimaginable human resilience. These young men had faced death daily, and yet they clung to life with a strength that defied the elements and the odds. In time, the survivors shared their story openly, not to glorify suffering, but to speak honestly about courage, unity, and the difficult moral lines drawn in extreme situations. Books like Alive by Piers Paul Read and documentaries such as Stranded and Society of the Snow have told their story with the depth and emotion it deserves. For many of the survivors, the Andes crash was not just a tragic memory, but a turning point that defined the rest of their lives. It remains one of the most powerful examples of human survival, not just of the body, but of the spirit. The story of Flight 571 is a haunting reminder that sometimes, even in the most unforgiving corners of the world, the will to live can push us beyond what we ever believed possible. On July 17th, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 took off from Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport, bound for Kuala Lumpur. It was supposed to be a routine, long-haul flight over Europe and Asia, a quiet 12 hours in the sky, with movies, meals, and mild turbulence. But somewhere over eastern Ukraine, cruising at 33,000 feet, everything changed in an instant. The plane vanished from radar, and before anyone could even grasp what had happened, debris was raining down over fields and villages near Hrabov, in a war-torn region embroiled in a bitter conflict between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists. All 298 people on board, passengers and crew, were killed. No distress call, no warning, just silence and smoke. What followed was a global outcry, a political mess, and one of the most intense international investigations the aviation world had ever seen. Almost immediately, suspicion pointed toward a surface-to-air missile, a Russian-made Buk system. It didn't take long before intelligence agencies, satellite images, and social media posts painted a picture. A missile launcher had been moved across the Russian border into separatist-held territory that day, and later returned suspiciously 1 missile short. The Dutch-led joint investigation team took the lead, combing through wreckage, tracking military hardware, analyzing flight paths, and even studying intercepted phone calls. What they found was damning. The missile was fired from an area controlled by pro-Russian fighters, using equipment traced back to a Russian military unit. It wasn't just an accident, it was a catastrophic mistake with geopolitical consequences. The passengers on board came from all over the world: the Netherlands, Malaysia, Australia, Indonesia, the UK, Germany, and several other countries. Among them were families, students, tourists, and researchers. There was even a large group of AIDS researchers heading to an international conference. Their loss was felt not just in their home countries, but globally. Grief turned into outrage. Governments demanded accountability. Russia, for its part, denied involvement, dismissed the investigation as biased, and pushed alternate theories, none of which held up under scrutiny. Meanwhile, images of teddy bears scattered in sunflower fields and the charred remains of the aircraft circulated widely, symbolizing the horror of war spilling into civilian life. In 2022, a Dutch court finally handed down its verdict. 3 men, 2 Russian nationals, and a Ukrainian separatist were convicted in absentia of murder and causing the crash. They were linked directly to the missile launcher and its deployment. The verdict didn't bring back the victims, but it offered some closure to the families. It also sent a message that even in the fog of war, justice might still find a way. More recently, in 2025, the International Civil Aviation Organization concluded that Russia violated international aviation law, further solidifying global consensus on the state's indirect responsibility. Separately, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Russia bore legal responsibility for the attack, adding yet another layer of international condemnation. What makes the MH17 tragedy stand out isn't just the scale of the loss or the political tension it stirred up, it's how clearly it showed the danger of modern conflicts overlapping with global air travel. It was a harsh reminder that war zones and commercial flight paths don't mix. Airliners full of innocent civilians don't belong in anyone's crosshairs. And yet, on that day in July, one did. The legacy of MH17 is still unfolding in courtrooms and diplomatic halls, but its human cost is eternal. Families were torn apart, lives were cut short, and a routine flight turned into a tragedy that circled the globe. There was no time to react, no second chance. Just one missile, one moment, and a sky that should have been safe, but wasn't. On December 21st, 1988, just days before Christmas, Pan Am Flight 103 was cruising peacefully at 31,000 feet, carrying 259 people across the Atlantic from London to New York. It was a routine transatlantic journey, the kind thousands make each day, with passengers thinking about holiday reunions, business meetings, or just getting home. But that peace shattered in an instant. Without warning, the plane exploded over the quiet Scottish town of Lockerbie, sending wreckage raining down across 845 square miles of countryside. The explosion tore the Boeing 747 apart mid-air, one of the most chilling acts of aviation terrorism the world had ever seen. All 259 people on board were killed instantly, and as the fiery debris slammed into the homes and streets below, 11 Lockerbie residents also lost their lives in a moment that turned their small town into the center of an international catastrophe. The blast was traced to a suitcase bomb hidden inside a tape recorder packed with Semtex plastic explosives, which had been checked onto the plane in Malta, transferred through Frankfurt, and finally loaded onto Flight 103 in London. The attack wasn't just devastating, it was deliberate. After a massive investigation involving the FBI, Scottish authorities, and countless international experts, the blame eventually landed on 2 Libyan intelligence agents, Abdelbasset al-Megrahi and Lamine Khalifa Fhimah. Years of political wrangling followed before al-Megrahi was finally convicted in 2001 in a special Scottish court in the Netherlands. Libya's then leader Muammar Gaddafi initially denied involvement, but in 2003, his government accepted responsibility for the bombing, paid compensation to the victims' families, and started clawing its way out of global isolation. But even then, many questions lingered. Was al-Megrahi really guilty? Was there more to the story? Numerous conspiracy theories have swirled around Lockerbie ever since, ranging from CIA cover-ups to botched drug stings to claims of planted evidence. In 2020, the U.S. charged a third man, Abu Aguila Masood, believed to have built the bomb. He was eventually extradited extradited and faces trial, showing how, decades later, the wheels of justice are still slowly grinding on. Beyond the politics and legal twists, the human impact of Lockerbie has been immense. Many of the victims were American college students returning home for the holidays, including 35 students from Syracuse University. The university has since built a major memorial and scholarship program in their honor, keeping their stories alive. In Lockerbie itself, grief turned into resilience. And over the years, the town has embraced the victims' families as their own, building friendships, holding vigils, and tending memorials that dot the landscape. And yet, even today, Lockerbie remains a byword for tragedy, reminding the world how a single act of terror can send shockwaves across continents. The crash site has been visited by thousands, from political leaders to grieving relatives, all trying to understand how something so violent could happen in such a peaceful place. While aviation security has come a long way since 1988, thanks in part to the hard lessons learned from Lockerbie, the incident still feels painfully relevant, especially in a world where air travel remains a soft target for those who seek to make a statement through destruction. The legacy of Pan Am Flight 103 is one of heartbreak, yes, but also of tenacity, remembrance, and the quiet strength of communities that refuse to let terror define them. Decades have passed, but the echoes of that December evening still linger in the Scottish skies and in the hearts of those who will never forget. On the morning of August 14th, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 took off from Larnaca, Cyprus, bound for Athens, Greece, with 121 people on board, a mix of vacationers, families, and crew looking forward to an ordinary day. But what followed was anything but ordinary. Shortly after takeoff, a small but deadly error began to unfold. The aircraft's pressurization system, which should have been set to automatic, had mistakenly been left on manual after a routine maintenance check. This meant that as the plane climbed higher, the cabin failed to properly pressurize. Within minutes, the air inside the aircraft grew dangerously thin. Alarms started sounding in the cockpit, but tragically, the crew misinterpreted them. The warning horn that blared, meant to indicate cabin pressure problems, was identical to the one for takeoff configuration errors. In the chaos and confusion, the pilots didn't realize they were slowly succumbing to hypoxia, a silent and creeping condition where the brain and body are starved of oxygen. As they lost consciousness, so did the rest of the people on board, one by one, until the plane was flying completely unresponsive on autopilot, a ghost in the sky. For the next 2 hours, the aircraft silently cruised over Greek airspace, completely out of contact. Greek fighter jets were scrambled to intercept the wayward 737, and what they saw was chilling. The cockpit windows were frosted over. The captain appeared slumped at the controls. Oxygen masks were hanging down inside the cabin, but no one was moving. It was clear to everyone watching from the ground and the sky that something had gone terribly wrong, but in a surprising twist, movement was suddenly spotted. Someone was alive. A flight attendant named Andreas Prodromou, one of the few people who had managed to put on an oxygen mask in time, had regained partial consciousness. Trained as a flight attendant and with some pilot experience, he made a heroic effort to save the aircraft. He fought his way to the cockpit, past unconscious passengers and low oxygen levels, and tried to take control. For a brief moment, the plane showed signs of manual input, a last-ditch effort to steer the doomed flight, but sadly, it was too late. With fuel nearly exhausted, the engines flamed out and the aircraft began to descend uncontrollably. At 12:04 p.m., it crashed into the hills near Grammatico, Greece, killing all on board. The investigation that followed uncovered a chain of small but fatal oversights: the switch in the wrong setting, the failure to recognize the hypoxia symptoms, and the confusion caused by identical warning sounds. Helios Airways and its procedures came under intense scrutiny, as did the design of the aircraft's alert systems. One of the most debated issues was how such a preventable technical oversight, a simple switch, could lead to a full-scale aviation disaster. The incident exposed how fragile safety can be when training gaps, mechanical oversight, and human error line up perfectly in the wrong way. In the aftermath, Boeing made changes to cockpit warning systems, and airlines worldwide reviewed pressurization training. But the tragedy of Flight 522 remains a haunting reminder of how silence in the skies can signal something far more sinister. A plane full of people, drifting on autopilot, unconscious and unreachable. It wasn't just a crash. It was a slow, quiet unraveling of life at 34000 feet. and the image of fighter pilots helplessly watching from the outside, unable to intervene, only adds to the heartbreak. Sometimes the scariest thing in aviation isn't the noise, it's the silence. On May 25, 1979, Chicago's O'Hare International Airport was bustling as usual, with travelers preparing for Memorial Day weekend getaways. Among them were 258 passengers and 13 crew members aboard American Airlines Flight 191, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 scheduled to fly to Los Angeles. At first glance, it seemed like any other flight, routine, smooth, and perfectly ordinary. But within moments of takeoff, that sense of normalcy shattered into one of the most devastating tragedies in U.S. aviation history. At 3:02 p.m., Flight 191 began its takeoff roll down runway 32R. Just as the aircraft was lifting off, the left engine suddenly separated from the wing, flipping over the top and tearing away part of the wing's leading edge in the process. To the average observer, it looked like the engine had just peeled off and tumbled away, a deeply unsettling sight that was unfortunately only the beginning. The engine loss wasn't just a matter of thrust. It severed critical hydraulic and electrical systems as well. The aircraft, now crippled and unbalanced, rolled sharply to the left just seconds after liftoff, stalled, and crashed in a fiery explosion into a nearby open field and trailer park. All 271 people on board were killed instantly, along with 2 individuals on the ground. It remains the deadliest aviation accident on American soil, and the images of the smoking wreckage left a haunting impression on the nation. The horror wasn't just in the loss of life, it was in the speed at which everything fell apart, and in the eerie fact that the crash was captured on film by a plane spotter who had been watching from a nearby parking lot. The investigation quickly zeroed in on the engine detachment. Initially, suspicions ranged from bird strikes to manufacturing defects, but the truth was more complex and more unsettling. American Airlines had been using a maintenance shortcut, removing the engine and pylon together as a unit using a forklift rather than separately as recommended. This risky method, although it saved time, put immense pressure on the pylon mount, causing tiny cracks that eventually led to catastrophic failure. Essentially, the engine tore itself away because of a shortcut that had gone unnoticed and uncorrected. The Federal Aviation Administration responded by grounding the entire fleet of DC-10s in the U.S., which caused public panic and massive disruptions. McDonnell Douglas, the aircraft's manufacturer, faced intense scrutiny, even though the fault ultimately lay in maintenance procedures, rather than the design itself. The crash of Flight 191 became a defining moment in aviation safety, prompting stricter regulations, tighter oversight, and a renewed emphasis on doing things by the book, especially when lives are at stake. Even decades later, Flight 191 is remembered not just for the tragic scale of its loss, but for how it exposed cracks, both literal and metaphorical, in the system. Memorials have been erected near the crash site, and every year, loved ones gather to honor those who lost their lives in a tragedy that could have been prevented. It's a painful reminder that in aviation, even the smallest shortcut can have the gravest consequences, and that safety is always written in lives, not just regulations.